The silence in the underground training facility was deafening. 37 of the world's most elite fighters had gathered in the concrete bunker beneath Chicago's industrial district, each one convinced they were witnessing the end of someone's career. In the center of the ring stood a woman whose unconventional movements had just been dismissed as playground dancing by a man twice her size. What none of them knew was that they were about to witness the unveiling of a combat system that would rewrite everything they thought they knew about fighting. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Blackwater Combat Academy had seen its share of unusual students over the years, but Rebecca Martinez was different in ways that went beyond her unorthodox training methods. When she first walked through the reinforced steel doors of the facility 3 months ago, veteran instructor Dale Richardson had assumed she was lost. The academy didn't advertise its location, and finding it required connections most civilians didn't possess. "I'm here for the Advanced Certification Program," Rebecca had said, her voice steady despite the skeptical stares from every direction. Richardson had looked her up and down, taking in her slight build and the absence of any visible muscle definition that typically marked serious fighters. "Ma'am, this isn't a fitness center. We train military contractors, security specialists, and professional fighters. The advanced program requires a minimum of 8 years documented combat experience." Rebecca had simply handed him a folder. Inside were certifications from 17 different martial arts schools across 3 countries, documentation of her service as a military police officer in the Army, and recommendation letters from instructors whose names Richardson recognized. What caught his attention wasn't the credentials themselves, but the dates. She had compressed what should have been decades of training into 12 years. "Impressive paperwork," Richardson had said, though his tone suggested otherwise. "But paperwork doesn't mean much in the ring. We'll need to see what you can actually do." The evaluation had been scheduled for the following Tuesday. Rebecca had arrived early, spending nearly an hour in the locker room reviewing handwritten notes in what appeared to be her own personal shorthand. When she finally emerged, she was wearing standard training gear, but something about her demeanor had shifted. The quiet confidence from their first meeting had been replaced by an almost meditative focus. The other students had gathered to watch, as they always did during evaluations. The academy's reputation attracted fighters who thrived on competition, and a newcomer's assessment was prime entertainment. Marcus Webb, a former Navy SEAL who held the facility's speed records, had positioned himself at ringside. "This should be interesting," Webb had muttered to his training partner Jake Sullivan. "Richardson's been talking about some mystery woman all week." Richardson had outlined the standard evaluation protocol: 3 rounds of sparring against progressively skilled opponents, followed by demonstrations of defensive techniques and weapon disarmament procedures. For the first match, he had selected Tommy Chen, a solid mid-level student whose straightforward boxing style would provide a baseline measurement of Rebecca's abilities. The moment the first round began, it became clear that Rebecca's approach was unlike anything the academy had seen. Instead of the expected combinations of punches, kicks, and grappling moves, she employed a fluid series of movements that seemed to flow from one position to the next, without the traditional stances that defined conventional martial arts. Chen had come forward with a standard jab-cross combination, expecting either a block, a counterattack, or defensive movement. Instead, Rebecca had shifted her weight in a way that moved her entire body along a diagonal line, simultaneously avoiding the punch while positioning herself for what appeared to be a counter. But instead of attacking, she had simply returned to a neutral position, as if the exchange had never happened. "What the hell was that?" Webb had asked, genuinely confused. The pattern had continued throughout the first round. Chen would attack using textbook techniques, and Rebecca would respond with movements that accomplished their defensive purpose but bore no resemblance to any recognized fighting system. She wasn't blocking punches so much as making them miss by inches. She wasn't dodging kicks but rather flowing around them like water around stones. By the second round, Chen had become frustrated. His attacks weren't landing, but he couldn't identify what Rebecca was doing to avoid them. Her movements looked almost casual, as if she was dancing to music only she could hear. Several times, she had been in position to land decisive counterattacks, but had chosen not to, instead maintaining the strange flow of defensive movements. Richardson had called for a break after the second round, pulling Rebecca aside. "What exactly are you doing in there?" he had asked. "I have never seen anything like those movements." "It's hard to explain," Rebecca had replied. "I've been developing a system that focuses on energy redirection rather than force-on-force contact. Traditional martial arts teach you to meet force with force, but I'm working on ways to redirect an opponent's energy while minimizing your own expenditure." "That's not how fighting works," Richardson had said flatly. "Pretty movements don't win fights. At some point, you need to be able to hit back." For the third round, Richardson had substituted Marcus Webb for Chen. Webb's approach was more aggressive and less predictable, incorporating elements from multiple disciplines. If Rebecca's system could handle a more dynamic opponent, it would prove its worth. If not, the evaluation would end quickly. Webb had opened with a feint, followed by a low kick, a combination designed to test defensive reactions. Rebecca's response had been even more unusual than her previous movements. She had stepped into the feint rather than away from it, somehow ending up behind Webb's lead leg as his kick extended. Her positioning should have left her vulnerable to his follow-up attack, but instead, Webb had found himself off balance and unable to continue his combination. "She's making me fight her fight," Webb had said during a brief pause. "I can't get into my rhythm because she's not where she's supposed to be." The watching students had begun to murmur among themselves. Rebecca's movements were undeniably effective at avoiding damage, but they defied explanation. She wasn't using the angles, timing, or positioning that any of them had been taught. More troubling, she seemed to be predicting her opponent's attacks with uncanny accuracy, moving to avoid strikes before they were fully committed. Jake Sullivan had been the most vocal critic. "This isn't fighting," he had announced to the group. "It's performance art. She's dancing around, avoiding engagement, and calling it a combat system. Put her against someone who won't let her run away and see what happens." Richardson had heard the comment and decided to test Sullivan's theory. For the final evaluation round, he had brought in Vincent Torres, a former professional MMA fighter whose aggressive style left opponents little room for evasive maneuvers. Torres was known for his ability to cut off escape routes and force exchanges in close quarters. The shift in Rebecca's demeanor had been immediate and noticeable. Against Torres, her flowing movements had taken on a different quality, becoming more angular and precise. When Torres had rushed forward with a combination designed to overwhelm her defensive options, Rebecca had done something that left the entire room stunned. Instead of avoiding the attack, she had moved directly into it, her body somehow threading through the spaces between Torres's strikes while simultaneously striking back. The sequence had lasted less than 3 seconds, but in that brief exchange, Rebecca had landed 4 clean hits while Torres had connected with none. Torres had stepped back, shaking his head. "I've never felt anything like that," he had said. "It was like fighting smoke that could hit back." The evaluation had continued for another 10 minutes, with Torres growing increasingly frustrated as his attacks met empty air while Rebecca's counterattacks found their mark with mechanical precision. When Richardson had finally called an end to the session, Torres was visibly winded while Rebecca appeared as fresh as when the round had begun. The room had fallen into an uncomfortable silence as the implications of what they had witnessed began to sink in. Rebecca's movements weren't just unusual, they represented a fundamental departure from everything the Academy taught. More unsettling was the realization that her system had proven effective against opponents using conventional techniques. Jake Sullivan had been the first to break the silence. "Anyone can look good when they're not really fighting," he had said, his voice carrying an edge of hostility. "This whole demonstration was just elaborate avoidance. In a real fight, you can't dance your way out of trouble." Several other students had nodded in agreement, their skepticism providing a comfortable alternative to accepting that their training might be incomplete. Marcus Webb had been more measured in his assessment, but even he had seemed reluctant to acknowledge the effectiveness of what they had seen. Richardson had dismissed the class without scheduling Rebecca's next training session, claiming he needed time to review the evaluation results. As the students had filed out, their conversations had centered on finding explanations for Rebecca's performance that didn't challenge their existing understanding of combat effectiveness. The whispers began the next morning. Word of Rebecca's unusual evaluation had spread beyond the Academy's walls, reaching the broader network of fighters, trainers, and combat sports enthusiasts who orbited around Chicago's underground scene. By Thursday, 3 separate fight promoters had contacted Richardson, asking about the woman who supposedly fought like, quote, liquid lightning. Rebecca remained unaware of the growing attention. She had spent the days following her evaluation in the Academy's research library, a cramped room filled with military manuals, combat psychology texts, and historical analyses of fighting systems from around the world. Her notebook, already thick with handwritten observations, grew heavier with each passing hour as she documented patterns she had observed during her sparring sessions. The breakthrough had come while reading a 1940s manual on battlefield hand-to-hand combat. The author, a former OSS operative named Colonel James Mitchell, had written extensively about the psychological aspects of close-quarters fighting. One passage in particular had captured Rebecca's attention. The most effective fighters are not those who have mastered the greatest number of techniques, but those who understand the fundamental principles that govern all physical confrontations. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. That evening, Rebecca had remained in the training facility long after the scheduled classes had ended. Using the empty space, she had begun working through a series of movements that built upon the principles she had been developing. What started as individual techniques gradually evolved into flowing sequences that incorporated elements of striking, grappling, and weapon defense into a unified system. Her movements were being watched. Jake Sullivan had returned to retrieve a forgotten piece of equipment and had discovered Rebecca training alone. Instead of announcing his presence, he had positioned himself where he could observe without being detected. What he saw challenged every assumption he had made about her abilities. Rebecca's solo training revealed the true scope of her system. The flowing movements she had demonstrated during her evaluation were just one component of a much larger framework. She transitioned seamlessly from empty-hand techniques to improvised weapon applications, using training equipment in ways that transformed everyday objects into defensive tools. A jump rope became a binding device. A water bottle served as both a striking implement and a means of redirecting an opponent's energy. Most remarkably, she appeared to be practicing variations on the same core movements, each adapted for different scenarios. The diagonal shift that had confused Tommy Chen during sparring was being applied to weapon disarmament situations. The threading movement she had used against Vincent Torres was being modified to work against multiple attackers. Sullivan had watched for nearly 40 minutes before Rebecca became aware of his presence. When she finally turned toward his hiding spot, her expression showed no surprise, as if she had known all along that she was being observed. "How long have you been working on this?" Sullivan had asked, stepping into the light. 12 years, Rebecca had replied simply. But the real development started about 3 years ago, when I began to understand that all fighting systems are built on the same fundamental movements. The styles look different, but the underlying principles are universal. Sullivan had been skeptical. "That's impossible. Boxing and jiu-jitsu have nothing in common. Wrestling and karate use completely different approaches." Rebecca had walked to the center of the training area. "Show me your best boxing combination," she had said. Sullivan had thrown a textbook jab-cross-hook combination, the kind of sequence that had served him well in dozens of competitive matches. Rebecca had moved in response, but instead of avoiding the punches, she had demonstrated how the same movement that deflected a boxing combination could be applied to escape a wrestling takedown, redirect a knife attack, or counter a kick. The distance changes, the timing shifts, and the specific applications vary, she had explained, but the core movement principle remains the same. Once you understand the underlying geometry of human combat, you can adapt to any situation using variations of the same fundamental techniques. For the next hour, Sullivan had attacked using techniques from different martial arts disciplines, while Rebecca demonstrated how her system addressed each approach using modified versions of the same core movements. By the end of the session, Sullivan's skepticism had transformed into something approaching awe. "This isn't just a fighting style," he had said. "You've created a whole new way of thinking about combat." Word of the late-night training session reached Marcus Webb the following day. Unlike Sullivan, who had become an unexpected advocate for Rebecca's approach, Webb remained convinced that unconventional methods were no substitute for proven techniques. He had arranged for Rebecca to participate in the Academy's weekly advanced sparring sessions, where senior students tested themselves against visiting fighters and military personnel. The Friday session had drawn an unusually large crowd. In addition to the Academy's regular students, several professional fighters and military contractors had arrived to witness what Webb was calling the ultimate test of theoretical combat versus practical application. Richardson had structured the session as a round-robin tournament, with participants rotating through different opponents every 10 minutes. The format was designed to test adaptability and endurance, qualities that Webb believed would expose the limitations of Rebecca's system. Rebecca's first opponent was Sarah Chen, Tommy's sister and a former collegiate wrestler who had transitioned into mixed martial arts. Sarah's game plan was straightforward: close the distance, establish control, and force Rebecca to fight from positions where her flowing movements would be constrained. The opening exchange had set the tone for everything that followed. Sarah had shot for a double-leg takedown, a fundamental wrestling technique that should have either succeeded or forced Rebecca into a defensive position. Instead, Rebecca had used Sarah's forward momentum against her, redirecting the takedown attempt while simultaneously establishing a dominant position. "She turned my takedown into her takedown," Sarah had explained during the break between rounds. "I've never seen anything like it. It was like she was using my own technique better than I was." Rebecca's second opponent, a kickboxer named David Rodriguez, had attempted to maintain distance and use his reach advantage. His strategy had been to stay on the outside and pick Rebecca apart with long-range strikes. The approach had failed spectacularly, as Rebecca demonstrated that her system worked equally well at all ranges. She had closed distance when Rodriguez tried to keep her away, created space when he attempted to crowd her, and consistently found angles that conventional footwork couldn't address. By the third rotation, the atmosphere in the training area had shifted. The casual conversations and side betting that typically accompanied sparring sessions had been replaced by intense focus, as participants and observers tried to understand what they were witnessing. Rebecca's third opponent had been Marcus Webb himself. His approach was methodical and aggressive, designed to test every aspect of her defensive capabilities. Webb had trained extensively in military combatives and possessed the kind of raw physicality that could overwhelm technique-based systems. The match had lasted the full 10 minutes, with Webb applying continuous pressure while Rebecca demonstrated the defensive aspects of her system. What had stunned the observers was not just her ability to avoid Webb's attacks, but the efficiency with which she did so. While Webb had grown noticeably fatigued from his aggressive assault, Rebecca appeared to be expending minimal energy in her defense. "It's like she's fighting a different fight," Vincent Torres had observed. "He's working twice as hard and accomplishing half as much." The final rotation had paired Rebecca with Jake Sullivan, who had volunteered specifically to demonstrate the offensive applications of her system. Unlike her previous opponents, Sullivan wasn't trying to defeat Rebecca. He was serving as a training partner to showcase techniques that pure defense couldn't reveal. The demonstration had been a revelation. Working with a cooperative opponent, Rebecca had shown how her defensive movements could transition seamlessly into offensive techniques. The same flowing motions that redirected attacks could be modified to create openings for counterstrikes. The positioning that allowed her to avoid damage also provided optimal angles for her own attacks. More importantly, she had begun to explain the principles behind her movements. Each technique was based on what she called geometric efficiency. The idea that the shortest distance between 2 points in a combat situation wasn't necessarily a straight line, but rather the path that accomplished multiple objectives simultaneously. "Traditional martial arts teach you to block and then counter," Rebecca had explained to the assembled group, "but blocking wastes energy and creates separate actions. Instead, I've developed movements that accomplish defense and offense as part of the same action. You're not adding extra steps to your response, you're making every movement serve multiple purposes." The session had concluded with an unprecedented request. Dr. Elizabeth Harper, a biomechanics researcher from the University of Chicago who had been observing, had asked permission to study Rebecca's movements using motion capture technology. The request had sparked a heated debate among the Academy's instructors about whether Rebecca's system represented a legitimate advancement in combat effectiveness, or simply an elaborate performance that worked only under controlled conditions. Webb had remained unconvinced. "Sparring isn't fighting," he had declared to the group. "All of this looks impressive, but we're talking about people who are pulling their punches and following safety protocols. Put her in a real situation where someone is actually trying to hurt her, and I guarantee this dancing routine falls apart." His words had carried weight with several of the observers, who had begun to voice similar doubts. The consensus seemed to be that Rebecca's system might work against traditional techniques, but would crumble when faced with someone who abandoned conventional approaches and simply tried to overwhelm her with raw aggression. Richardson had found himself in an impossible position. Rebecca's demonstrations had been undeniably impressive, but they had also challenged the foundation of everything the Academy taught. If her system was truly superior, it called into question decades of established training methods. If it wasn't, then the Academy risked its reputation by association with what critics were beginning to call theoretical fighting. The solution had come from an unexpected source. Tony Castellano, a connected figure in Chicago's underground fighting scene, had been present during the Friday session. Castellano had approached Richardson after the other participants had left, proposing a definitive test of Rebecca's abilities. "There's a private event next weekend," Castellano had explained. "High-level fighters, serious money, no cameras. If she's as good as she looks, she'll have no problem proving it. If not, everyone will know, and we can put this whole thing to rest." Richardson had been reluctant to expose one of his students to the kind of no-holds-barred environment that Castellano's events were known for, but the pressure to resolve the questions surrounding Rebecca's system had been mounting. The underground fighting circuit attracted participants who wouldn't be constrained by sparring protocols or safety considerations. It would provide the ultimate test of whether Rebecca's techniques could function in genuinely hostile situations. The decision had been made without consulting Rebecca. By Sunday morning, word had spread throughout the Academy that their most controversial student would be facing real opposition within the week. The announcement had divided the school into two camps: those who believed Rebecca would revolutionize combat training, and those who expected to witness the spectacular failure of an untested system. Neither group was prepared for what would actually unfold in the concrete basement of an abandoned warehouse on Chicago's South Side, where Rebecca would face opponents who had never heard of geometric efficiency but understood violence with crystal clarity. The warehouse stood like a monument to industrial decay in Chicago's Pilsen district, its broken windows and rust-stained walls hiding one of the city's most exclusive underground venues. Every Saturday night, the building's basement transformed into an arena where reputation and money changed hands with surgical precision. The concrete floor bore permanent stains that told stories no one discussed in daylight. Rebecca had arrived 3 hours early, using the empty space to familiarize herself with the environment. The basement's dimensions were smaller than the Academy's training area, with support pillars that would affect movement patterns, and a low ceiling that would limit certain techniques. More importantly, the concrete floor offered no forgiveness for mistakes that would be minor inconveniences on padded surfaces. Tony Castellano had briefed her on the evening's format during their Wednesday meeting. 3 fights, escalating in difficulty, with each opponent representing a different challenge to her system. The first would test her against raw power and aggression. The second would pit her against technical expertise and ring experience. The third remained a mystery that Castellano had refused to discuss. "The people coming tonight aren't Academy students or weekend warriors," Castellano had warned. "These are individuals who've made violence their profession. They're not interested in testing theories or exploring new approaches. They want to win, and they'll use whatever methods accomplish that goal." By 8 o'clock, the basement had filled with an unusual mix of spectators. Professional fighters mingled with military personnel, while representatives from various martial arts schools observed alongside individuals whose occupations were better left unexamined. The diversity of the crowd reflected the significance of what was about to unfold. Richardson had positioned himself near the makeshift ring, accompanied by Jake Sullivan and several other Academy instructors. Their presence served dual purposes: moral support for Rebecca and damage control if the evening went badly. The Academy's reputation was now tied to her performance in ways that made Richardson deeply uncomfortable. Marcus Webb had chosen a different vantage point, joining a group of skeptics who had come specifically to witness what they expected would be an educational failure. Among them was Detective Ray Morrison of the Chicago PD, whose expertise in real-world violence had made him particularly dismissive of what he called studio fighting. "I've seen hundreds of scraps," Morrison had told his companions. "Real fights last about 30 seconds and involve a lot of grabbing, falling, and desperate swinging. All this flowing movement nonsense disappears the moment someone gets grabbed by the throat." Rebecca's first opponent emerged from the crowd at 9:15. Carl Donovan stood 6 feet 4 inches and weighed nearly 270 pounds, his massive frame built through years of construction work and powerlifting. Donovan's approach to fighting was refreshingly straightforward: overwhelm opponents with superior size and strength while absorbing whatever damage they could inflict in return. "I don't know what kind of dancing you've been doing at that fancy academy," Donovan had announced to the crowd, "but down here we settle things the old-fashioned way." The opening moments of their encounter had seemed to validate every criticism of Rebecca's system. Donovan's initial assault was precisely the kind of overwhelming aggression that conventional wisdom suggested would neutralize technical superiority. He charged forward like a human bulldozer, using his reach and mass to occupy space and limit Rebecca's movement options. For the first 60 seconds, Rebecca appeared to be in serious trouble. Donovan's attacks came too fast and from too many angles for her to establish the flowing patterns that had impressed Academy observers. She was forced into purely reactive mode, dodging and weaving without the elegant precision that had characterized her previous demonstrations. The crowd's energy had shifted accordingly. The skeptics were beginning to voice their satisfaction, while Rebecca's supporters watched with growing concern as she appeared to be systematically overwhelmed by Donovan's relentless pressure. Then something changed. Rebecca stopped trying to avoid Donovan's attacks and began to work with them instead. When he threw a massive overhand right, she stepped into the punch rather than away from it, using his momentum to spin him off balance. When he attempted to grab her with both hands, she allowed the contact but redirected his grip in ways that left him controlling empty air while she moved to advantageous positions. The transformation was dramatic and immediate. Within 30 seconds, Rebecca had gone from defensive survival to complete control of the engagement. Donovan's size and strength, which had initially seemed overwhelming, became liabilities as Rebecca used his own power against him. Every movement he made was redirected. Every attack was turned into an opportunity for her to improve her position. The conclusion had been both inevitable and stunning. Donovan, despite his physical advantages, found himself completely unable to land meaningful strikes, while Rebecca systematically dismantled his defenses. The fight ended when she applied what appeared to be a simple arm lock that somehow incorporated leverage from 3 different angles, leaving Donovan with no choice but to submit or risk serious injury. "That wasn't fighting," Detective Morrison had muttered, though his tone suggested confusion rather than dismissal. "That was something else entirely." Rebecca's second opponent represented a completely different challenge. Elena Vasquez was a former professional boxer who had transitioned into mixed martial arts, accumulating an impressive record against high-level competition. Where Donovan had relied on raw physicality, Vasquez brought technical precision and ring intelligence developed through hundreds of professional matches. Vasquez's approach was methodical and patient. She had studied Rebecca's first fight, noting the techniques used against Donovan and developing countermeasures. Her strategy was to avoid the kinds of committed attacks that Rebecca seemed to excel at redirecting, instead using feints, jabs, and probing strikes to test defensive reactions. The second fight had unfolded as a chess match between contrasting philosophies. Vasquez employed traditional boxing footwork and combinations, trying to establish rhythm and timing that would allow her to land clean shots. Rebecca responded with movements that seemed designed to disrupt those rhythms, constantly changing distance and angle in ways that prevented Vasquez from settling into familiar patterns. For several minutes, the fight had appeared even. Vasquez's technical skill allowed her to avoid the kinds of dramatic redirections that had undone Donovan, while Rebecca's system proved adaptable enough to handle orthodox boxing techniques. The exchanges were subtle, involving micro-adjustments of position and timing rather than the obvious domination that had characterized the first fight. The turning point had come when Vasquez attempted to establish a clinch, seeking to neutralize Rebecca's movement advantages through close-quarters control. The attempt backfired spectacularly, as Rebecca demonstrated that her system worked even more effectively at close range. What should have been a controlling position for Vasquez became an opportunity for Rebecca to apply techniques that had no equivalent in traditional martial arts. "She's not just redirecting single techniques," observed Dr. Elizabeth Harper, who had been taking detailed notes throughout the evening. "She's redirecting entire fighting strategies. Vasquez is being forced to fight Rebecca's fight, even when she thinks she's implementing her own game plan." The second fight had ended with Vasquez voluntarily stopping the action, claiming that she felt disoriented and unable to mount effective offense. Medical examination revealed no obvious injuries, but Vasquez described feeling like I was fighting while drunk due to her inability to establish familiar timing and distance relationships. Tony Castellano had used the break between fights to address the crowd directly. Ladies and gentlemen, what we've witnessed tonight has been extraordinary by any measure. However, I think we can all agree that true validation requires testing against the most challenging possible opposition. His words had carried an ominous undertone that became clear when Rebecca's third opponent was revealed. Instead of a single fighter, she would face two opponents simultaneously. Brothers Marcus and David Sullivan, both former military special operations personnel who had developed their own two-man fighting system during overseas deployments. The Sullivan brothers represented the ultimate test of Rebecca's abilities. Their system was specifically designed to overwhelm individual opponents through coordinated attacks that eliminated escape routes and forced disadvantageous positions. They had never been defeated as a team, and their reputation in underground circles was built on the systematic dismantling of fighters who dominated individual competition. 2-on-1 isn't fair, Marcus Sullivan had announced to the crowd, but fairness isn't the point. The point is to determine whether these techniques work when someone really wants to hurt you and has the skills to make it happen. The brothers' opening attack had been a masterpiece of tactical coordination. They approached from opposite angles, using complementary techniques that created no safe defensive options using conventional methods. One brother's strikes forced movement into the path of the other's attacks, while their positioning eliminated the escape routes that single opponents typically provided. For the first time all evening, Rebecca had appeared genuinely challenged. The flowing movements that had neutralized individual opponents became complex geometric problems when applied to multiple attackers with coordinated strategies. She was forced to work at a level of precision that left no room for error, as any mistake would result in being caught between two skilled opponents. The crowd had fallen silent as they watched Rebecca navigate the most technically demanding fight of her career. Every movement had to serve multiple purposes, avoiding one attacker's strikes while positioning for defense against the other, creating opportunities to separate the brothers while maintaining awareness of both their positions. What followed was a demonstration of fighting artistry that transcended anything the underground circuit had previously witnessed. Rebecca began to turn the brothers' coordination against them, using their need to avoid striking each other as a weakness she could exploit. Her movements became a form of human geometry, creating angles and positions that forced the Sullivan brothers to interfere with each other's attacks. The climax had come when Rebecca managed to briefly separate the brothers, engaging each one individually for a few crucial seconds. In those moments, she demonstrated techniques that no one in the crowd had ever seen before. Movements that incorporated elements of striking, grappling, and weapon applications flowed together in combinations that seemed to violate the normal rules of physics. Both brothers had found themselves simultaneously controlled by what appeared to be a single, flowing technique that had somehow evolved to address multiple opponents occupying different positions. The precision required to execute such movements was almost incomprehensible, representing the synthesis of years of development into a few seconds of perfect application. When the dust settled, both Sullivan brothers were on the ground, neither seriously injured, but both completely unable to continue effective resistance. The technique that had defeated them was impossible to categorize using traditional martial arts terminology. It existed somewhere between striking and grappling, incorporating leverage and momentum in ways that conventional training had never addressed. The warehouse had erupted in chaos as spectators tried to process what they had witnessed. Some demanded immediate explanations, others called for Rebecca to teach them her techniques, while a few insisted that what they had seen was impossible and must have involved some form of deception. Tony Castellano had restored order by announcing that the evening's events would be discussed by invitation only, and that anyone attempting to record or publicize what they had witnessed would find themselves permanently excluded from future events. His words carried the weight of someone accustomed to enforcing compliance through methods that didn't involve legal proceedings. Rebecca had remained in the center of the basement, surrounded by individuals who suddenly viewed her as something entirely unprecedented. The woman who had arrived as a curiosity from a local academy had revealed herself as the creator of a combat system that challenged fundamental assumptions about human physical confrontation. The warehouse basement had transformed into an impromptu lecture hall with folding chairs arranged in a rough semicircle around the concrete floor where Rebecca stood. 3 days had passed since the underground fights, and word of what had transpired had spread through networks that connected Chicago's martial arts community to military training facilities, law enforcement academies, and private security firms across the Midwest. Dr. Elizabeth Harper had arrived with a team of graduate students and enough recording equipment to document what she was calling the most significant development in combat biomechanics since the advent of mixed martial arts. Her university had approved an emergency research grant after viewing preliminary footage of Rebecca's techniques, though the official paperwork carefully avoided mentioning the illegal venue where the recordings had been obtained. The crowd gathering for Rebecca's first public demonstration included faces that represented decades of combat experience. Colonel Patricia Hayes had driven down from Fort Sheridan, bringing with her a team of military combatives instructors who trained Army Rangers and Special Forces personnel. Detective Morrison had returned with several fellow officers, his earlier skepticism replaced by professional curiosity about applications in law enforcement. Marcus Webb sat in the front row, his notebook already filled with questions he intended to ask during the demonstration. The underground fights had forced him to confront the limitations of his own understanding, and he had spent the previous 3 days studying video footage frame by frame, trying to identify the principles behind movements that defied conventional analysis. Rebecca had used the time since the fights to prepare something unprecedented, a systematic breakdown of her combat system that would reveal the theoretical framework underlying techniques that had appeared almost magical in application. She had filled 17 pages with diagrams, equations, and movement sequences that translated years of intuitive development into teachable concepts. "Before we begin," Rebecca announced to the assembled group, "I want to address the elephant in the room. What you witnessed on Saturday night wasn't magic, and it wasn't the result of superhuman abilities. Everything I demonstrated can be understood, learned, and applied by anyone willing to reconsider their assumptions about how human bodies interact during physical confrontations." She gestured toward a whiteboard that had been wheeled into the basement, covered with diagrams that looked more like engineering schematics than martial arts techniques. Traditional fighting systems are built around the concept of technique catalogs, discrete movements that are learned, practiced, and applied in appropriate situations. My approach is different. Instead of learning individual techniques, I've developed a system based on fundamental movement principles that can be adapted to any situation. Dr. Harper raised her hand. "Can you explain what you mean by fundamental principles? Are you referring to biomechanical concepts or something else entirely?" Rebecca picked up a marker and began drawing on the whiteboard. "Human combat is governed by the same physical laws that govern all interactions between moving objects: force, momentum, leverage, geometry. These aren't abstract concepts in fighting, they're the tools that determine success or failure." She drew 2 figures facing each other, then added arrows indicating direction and force vectors. Traditional martial arts teach you to meet force with force. If someone punches you, you block the punch. If someone grabs you, you break the grab. This approach works, but it's inefficient because it requires you to generate equal or greater force than your opponent. The diagram evolved as she spoke, showing how conventional defensive techniques created predictable force interactions. My system is based on the principle that you don't need to stop an attack, you just need to make it miss. And if you can make it miss in a way that improves your position while worsening your opponent's, you've accomplished multiple objectives with a single movement. Colonel Hayes leaned forward. "That sounds like basic defensive theory. What makes your approach different from standard evasion techniques?" Rebecca smiled and erased part of the diagram. "Standard evasion focuses on moving your body away from the attack. My system focuses on moving the attack away from your body. The difference is crucial because it allows you to maintain offensive options while defending." She redrew the figures, this time showing curved lines that represented redirected force rather than absorbed or avoided force. When you redirect an attack rather than simply avoiding it, you're borrowing your opponent's energy to fuel your own movements. They provide the power, you provide the direction. Jake Sullivan, who had become one of Rebecca's most dedicated students, volunteered to demonstrate. "Show them the basic principle," he suggested. "Start with something simple." Rebecca nodded and positioned herself facing Sullivan. "Jake is going to throw a straight punch at my face. Instead of blocking, ducking, or stepping backward, I'm going to redirect his attack using minimal energy, while simultaneously creating an opportunity for my own counterattack. Sullivan threw a controlled but committed punch. Rebecca's response appeared deceptively simple, a slight movement of her hands that guided Sullivan's punch past her face, while stepping into a position that left him vulnerable to several different counterattacks. She didn't deliver any strikes, instead freezing the position so the observers could analyze the geometry. "Notice that my hands never opposed Jake's punch directly," Rebecca explained, maintaining the position. "Instead, I provided a guidance system that allowed his force to continue in a new direction. From his perspective, he threw a perfect punch that simply didn't hit anything. From my perspective, I used his energy to move myself into an advantageous position." She released the position and gestured for Sullivan to reset. "Now we'll do the same exchange at full speed and see how the principle applies to real timing." The second demonstration revealed the true sophistication of Rebecca's system. At combat speed, the redirection became nearly invisible, appearing to outside observers as if Sullivan's punch had somehow missed, despite being aimed correctly. Rebecca's counterattack flowed so naturally from the defensive movement that it seemed like a single, continuous action. Detective Morrison stood up. "That looks impressive, but what happens when someone doesn't throw perfect punches? Real fights involve a lot of grabbing, wrestling, and sloppy technique." Rebecca had anticipated the question. "The beauty of principle-based training is that it applies regardless of your opponent's technique quality. Sloppy attacks are actually easier to redirect because they contain more wasted energy and create more opportunities for redirection." She called for a volunteer from the audience, selecting a heavy-set man named Frank Kowalski who worked security at several downtown nightclubs. Kowalski's fighting experience came from breaking up bar fights rather than formal training, giving him exactly the kind of rough, aggressive style that Morrison had referenced. "Frank, I want you to try to grab me and control me however you would handle someone causing trouble at your club," Rebecca instructed. "Don't worry about technique or form, just do whatever feels natural." Kowalski's attack was everything that formal martial arts training taught students to avoid: wild, overcommitted, and technically unsound. He lunged forward with both hands extended, trying to grab Rebecca's clothing and overpower her through superior mass and aggression. Rebecca's response demonstrated that her system worked even more effectively against unrefined attacks. Kowalski's lack of technical precision created multiple opportunities for redirection, and his overcommitment made it impossible for him to adjust when his initial strategy failed. Within seconds, he found himself controlled and off balance, unable to understand how his size and strength advantages had been neutralized. Untrained attackers often telegraph their intentions and commit completely to single actions, Rebecca explained as she released Kowalski. "This makes them predictable and gives you more time to implement redirections. Trained fighters are actually more challenging because they can adjust their techniques mid-execution." Dr. Harper had been taking notes throughout the demonstration. "You mentioned that your system was based on 50 different techniques. Can you show us how these techniques relate to the principles you've described?" Rebecca paused, considering how to address the question that went to the heart of her system's development. "That's not exactly accurate. I haven't developed 50 separate techniques. I've identified 50 applications of the same core principles. Each application addresses different scenarios, ranges, and opponent strategies, but they're all variations on the same fundamental concepts." She moved to a clear section of the floor and began demonstrating what she called the base form, a series of movements that incorporated all the essential elements of her system. To untrained observers, it looked like a complex dance or kata. To experienced fighters, it revealed the geometric relationships that governed effective combat movement. "This sequence contains the building blocks for every technique in my system," Rebecca explained as she moved through the form. "The same movement that redirects a punch can be adapted to escape a grab, counter a kick, or disarm a weapon. The applications change, but the underlying principle remains constant." She paused mid-form and called Sullivan back to the demonstration area. "Jake understands my system well enough to attack me using techniques specifically designed to counter redirection. This will show you how the principles adapt to opposition that knows what to expect." The resulting exchange was unlike anything the observers had seen during Rebecca's previous demonstrations. Sullivan attacked using combinations that anticipated her redirections, forcing her to work at a level of sophistication that revealed the true depth of her system. Each redirection led to a counter-redirection, creating complex chains of movement that looked like a choreographed performance but were actually high-level combat applications. This is what fighting looks like when both participants understand advanced principles, Rebecca explained as she and Sullivan continued their exchange. It becomes a conversation conducted through movement, with each person responding to the other's techniques using increasingly sophisticated applications. The demonstration concluded with Rebecca successfully applying one of her most complex techniques, a redirection sequence that addressed multiple attacks while simultaneously creating offensive opportunities. The movement was beautiful in its efficiency, accomplishing in seconds what conventional techniques would require multiple separate actions to achieve. Colonel Hayes stood up as the demonstration ended. This has implications that go far beyond individual fighting techniques. You've developed a training methodology that could revolutionize how we prepare personnel for close-quarters combat situations. Dr. Harper nodded enthusiastically. Biomechanical efficiency alone could reduce training time while improving effectiveness. We need to document everything and begin developing curricula for different applications. Rebecca held up her hand to quiet the growing excitement. Before we get ahead of ourselves, there's something important you need to understand. What you've seen today represents 12 years of development and thousands of hours of practice. This isn't a quick-fix system that can be learned in a weekend seminar. She walked to the whiteboard and wrote a single word in large letters: principles. The techniques are impressive, but they're not the real innovation. The breakthrough is the underlying framework that generates those techniques. Once you understand the principles, you can develop your own applications. Once you master the principles, you can adapt to any situation using variations of the same core concepts. Marcus Webb raised his hand. How long does it take to reach functional proficiency in your system? Rebecca considered the question carefully. That depends on your definition of functional proficiency. Basic redirection principles can be learned in a few months. Applying those principles under stress takes longer. Developing the ability to adapt principles to novel situations, that's a lifetime of work. She gestured toward the diagrams on the whiteboard. What I've shown you today is the result of breaking down human combat into its essential components and rebuilding it from first principles. The 50 techniques aren't 50 different things to memorize. They're 50 ways of applying the same understanding to different problems. Tony Castellano, who had been observing quietly from the back of the room, finally spoke up. The question everyone's thinking but not asking is this: what happens next? You've proven your system works. You've explained the theory behind it. Where does this knowledge go from here? The question hung in the air as representatives from military, law enforcement, academic, and private security organizations contemplated the implications of what they had witnessed. Rebecca's system represented more than just effective fighting techniques. It offered a completely new paradigm for understanding human physical confrontation. Rebecca looked around the room at faces that represented decades of combat experience and institutional knowledge. That depends on whether you're willing to question everything you think you know about fighting and start learning from the beginning. The principles are simple, but implementing them requires abandoning a lot of assumptions that feel fundamental to traditional training. She walked to the center of the floor and assumed a neutral stance. The choice is yours. You can continue using techniques that work most of the time against most opponents, or you can learn principles that work all the time against any opponent. Both approaches have value, but only one of them acknowledges that human combat is governed by laws that don't change based on style or preference. The basement fell silent as the assembled experts contemplated a future where everything they thought they knew about fighting might need to be reconsidered. In that moment of quiet reflection, Rebecca Martinez had accomplished something unprecedented. She had forced an entire community of combat professionals to confront the possibility that mastery was not the end of learning, but merely the beginning of understanding. 6 months after the basement demonstration, the Blackwater Combat Academy had been transformed beyond recognition. What had once been a traditional martial arts school now served as the primary research facility for what academics were calling the Martinez Method. The concrete training floor had been fitted with motion capture sensors, force measurement platforms, and high-speed cameras capable of recording movements at 10,000 frames per second. Dr. Elizabeth Harper's research team had documented over 300 variations of Rebecca's core principles, creating the most comprehensive analysis of human combat biomechanics ever undertaken. Their preliminary findings had already influenced training protocols at 17 military installations, 12 police academies, and 43 private security firms across North America. The transformation hadn't come without controversy. Traditional martial arts schools had initially dismissed Rebecca's work as academic theory divorced from practical application. That criticism had evaporated after a series of challenge matches where Rebecca's students consistently defeated practitioners with decades of conventional training. The most dramatic of these contests had occurred at the International Combat Sports Convention in Las Vegas, where Master Chen Weilin, a 70-year-old Kung Fu grandmaster with 50 years of teaching experience, had publicly challenged the legitimacy of principle-based training. The match had lasted less than 3 minutes, ending when Chen's most advanced student found himself unable to mount any effective offense against Rebecca's newest protege, a former accountant named Patricia Williams, who had been training for just 8 months. "It's not that traditional techniques are wrong," Rebecca had explained to the stunned audience. "They're just incomplete. Every martial art contains fragments of the principles I've systematized, but none of them recognize the underlying unity that connects all effective movement." The convention incident had triggered a phenomenon that Rebecca had never anticipated: a mass migration of instructors seeking to understand her methods. The Blackwater Academy now hosted monthly seminars that drew participants from around the world, creating waiting lists that stretched 6 months into the future. Among the most dedicated converts was Master Elena Petrov, a former Soviet military combatives instructor whose students had dominated European fighting competitions for 2 decades. Petrov had arrived in Chicago expecting to debunk what she considered, quote, American innovation for its own sake, and had stayed to become Rebecca's first certified instructor. "In the Soviet system, we believed that superior conditioning and technical precision could overcome any opponent," Petrov had explained during her certification interview. "Rebecca showed me that efficiency makes conditioning irrelevant and that principles make technique obsolete. My students now accomplish in months what previously required years of development." The certification program had become a necessity as demand for qualified instruction overwhelmed Rebecca's ability to teach personally. The process was rigorous, requiring candidates to demonstrate not just technical proficiency, but also the conceptual understanding necessary to adapt principles to novel situations. Current certification candidates included Dr. James Mitchell, a biomechanics professor from MIT, whose analysis of Rebecca's movements had revealed mathematical relationships previously unknown to sports science. His research had shown that Rebecca's techniques generated force vectors that achieved maximum efficiency while minimizing energy expenditure, creating what he termed geometric optimization of human kinetic potential. Another candidate was Captain Sarah Rodriguez, a Marine Corps officer whose combat experience in 3 overseas deployments had convinced her that traditional military training was inadequately preparing personnel for real-world confrontations. Her adaptation of Rebecca's principles for battlefield applications had reduced casualty rates in her unit by 30% during their most recent deployment. The military implications had attracted attention at the highest levels of the Defense Department. General Robert Morrison had personally visited the academy after receiving reports that Rebecca's methods were producing soldiers capable of neutralizing multiple opponents with minimal risk of injury to themselves or others. "Modern warfare requires precision application of force," Morrison had explained during his visit. "Soldiers trained in the Martinez method can accomplish mission objectives while adhering to rules of engagement that would constrain conventionally trained personnel. This has strategic implications that extend far beyond individual combat effectiveness." The general's endorsement had led to the establishment of a classified research program at Fort Bragg, where Rebecca worked with Special Forces instructors to develop applications for hostage rescue, crowd control, and counterterrorism operations. The program remained officially unacknowledged, but its influence was visible in the changing tactics employed by elite military units. Law enforcement had proven equally receptive to Rebecca's innovations. Detective Morrison, whose initial skepticism had evolved into evangelical enthusiasm, had spearheaded adoption of her methods by the Chicago Police Department. Officers trained in principle-based techniques were showing remarkable success rates in subduing violent suspects without causing serious injuries or requiring backup assistance. "Traditional police defensive tactics create confrontations," Morrison had observed. "Officers are taught to meet resistance with greater resistance, which escalates situations and increases the risk of serious injury to everyone involved. Rebecca's methods allow officers to control suspects using their own aggressive energy against them." The department's statistics were compelling. Use of force incidents had decreased by 45% among officers trained in the Martinez method, while successful arrest rates had increased proportionally. More importantly, Citizen complaints alleging excessive force had dropped to near zero among participating officers. These successes had attracted international attention. Representatives from law enforcement agencies in 17 countries had visited Chicago to observe training sessions, leading to pilot programs in the United Kingdom, Germany, and Australia. The Australian Federal Police had been particularly impressed with applications for handling domestic violence situations, where traditional restraint techniques often proved inadequate for controlling agitated individuals without causing injury. Private sector adoption had proceeded even more rapidly. Corporate security firms had discovered that Rebecca's techniques were ideal for situations requiring minimal force application. Hotel security, retail loss prevention, and executive protection services had found that principle-based methods allowed them to handle difficult situations while avoiding the legal liabilities associated with traditional restraint techniques. The most surprising development had been adoption by healthcare professionals. Dr. Andrea Walsh, Chief of Emergency Medicine at Northwestern Memorial Hospital, had implemented Rebecca's principles for managing violent psychiatric patients. Medical staff trained in redirection techniques were successfully controlling agitated individuals without requiring chemical restraints or multiple personnel. Psychiatric patients in crisis often possess unexpected strength and endurance, Dr. Walsh had explained. Traditional restraint methods require multiple staff members and carry significant risk of injury to both patient and caregivers. Rebecca's techniques allow a single nurse to safely control even severely agitated individuals using minimal force. The medical applications had led to collaborations with physical therapy programs, where Rebecca's movement principles were being adapted for rehabilitation purposes. Patients recovering from injuries were learning to redirect their body's compensation patterns rather than fighting against them, leading to faster recovery times and reduced risk of secondary injuries. Educational institutions had begun incorporating principle-based training into their curricula as well. The University of Illinois had established the first academic program in applied movement dynamics, offering degrees that combined Rebecca's methods with traditional sports science and biomechanical engineering. Professor David Chen, who directed the program, had become one of Rebecca's most effective advocates in academic circles. "We're not teaching students to become fighters," he had emphasized during a national education conference. "We're teaching them to understand the fundamental principles that govern all human movement. These principles apply to athletics, dance, physical therapy, and countless other fields." The program's graduates were finding employment in industries that had never previously considered combat applications. Video game developers were using principle-based movement analysis to create more realistic character animations. Physical therapists were applying redirection concepts to help patients overcome movement limitations. Even architects were incorporating spatial relationship principles learned from Rebecca's system into their building designs. The technology sector had shown unexpected interest as well. Robotics engineers had discovered that Rebecca's movement principles could be programmed into artificial systems, creating robots capable of navigating complex physical interactions with unprecedented efficiency. The military applications for such robots were immediately apparent, leading to classified contracts worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Virtual reality developers had found that incorporating Rebecca's spatial principles into their systems created more immersive experiences. Users equipped with VR systems based on her movement analysis reported feeling more connected to their virtual environments and achieving better performance in simulated tasks. The commercial success had created opportunities that Rebecca had never imagined when she first walked into the Blackwater Academy. Publishing companies had offered seven-figure advances for books describing her methods. Documentary filmmakers had proposed comprehensive examinations of her system's development. Technology companies wanted to license her principles for incorporation into consumer fitness products. Rebecca had turned down most of these opportunities, preferring to focus on research and instruction rather than commercial exploitation. However, she had agreed to work with a select group of partners to ensure that accurate information about her methods remained available to serious students. The partnership with Dr. Harper's research team had produced the definitive academic treatment of principle-based combat, a 1,000-page analysis that had become required reading in biomechanics programs worldwide. The book's mathematical proofs had settled long-standing debates about optimal force application, while its practical exercises provided clear pathways for implementation. A more accessible version had been developed for general audiences, focusing on the philosophical implications of Rebecca's discoveries rather than technical details. This book had become an unexpected bestseller, resonating with readers interested in efficiency, problem-solving, and personal development beyond combat applications. The speaking circuit had also proven lucrative, with Rebecca commanding substantial fees for presentations to corporate audiences, military leadership, and academic conferences. Her TED Talk on The Geometry of Human Conflict has been viewed over 15 million times, inspiring countless individuals to reconsider their approaches to competition and confrontation in all areas of life. Despite the success and recognition, Rebecca remained focused on continuous development of her system. Her current research involved applications for multiple opponent scenarios, weapon integration, and environmental adaptation. Each advancement revealed new depths to principles that had initially seemed simple but were proving to contain infinite complexity. The most intriguing development was her work on teaching methodology. Rebecca had discovered that different individuals responded to different aspects of her system, requiring customized approaches that matched students' natural learning patterns. This had led to the development of assessment protocols that could identify optimal training paths for any individual within hours of initial evaluation. The assessment system had revealed surprising patterns in human movement potential. Some individuals showed natural affinity for redirection principles, while others excelled at geometric optimization. A few rare students demonstrated what Rebecca called principle integration, the ability to seamlessly combine multiple aspects of the system into novel applications. These discoveries had profound implications for human potential research. If movement principles could be identified and optimized on an individual basis, similar approaches might apply to cognitive abilities, emotional regulation, and social interaction. Rebecca had begun collaborating with neuroscientists to explore whether her movement principles reflected deeper patterns in human neural organization. The research had already yielded fascinating preliminary results. Brain scans of students learning principle-based techniques showed activation patterns unlike those seen in traditional skill acquisition. The neural pathways developed through Rebecca's training seemed to enhance overall cognitive flexibility, suggesting that movement optimization could improve mental performance in unrelated areas. As Rebecca stood in her transformed academy, surrounded by equipment that would have been unimaginable 6 months earlier, she reflected on a journey that had begun with simple curiosity about human movement efficiency. What had started as personal exploration had evolved into a comprehensive understanding of physical interaction that was reshaping fields as diverse as military tactics, healthcare, education, and technology. The woman who had once been dismissed as a practitioner of playground dancing had proven that innovation could emerge from the synthesis of existing knowledge viewed through fresh perspectives. Her 50 techniques had become the foundation for thousands of applications, each one demonstrating that human potential was limited only by the breadth of understanding brought to its development. 2 years had passed since Rebecca Martinez first stepped into the Blackwater Combat Academy, and the world of human performance had been irreversibly altered. What began as a personal quest to understand movement efficiency had evolved into a global revolution that challenged fundamental assumptions about human potential across dozens of disciplines. The morning sun filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Martinez Institute for Applied Human Dynamics, a $50 million facility that had been constructed specifically to house the expanding research into principle-based performance optimization. The building's architecture itself reflected Rebecca's influence, with flowing spaces designed according to geometric principles that maximized efficiency of movement and interaction. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, the Institute's newly appointed Director of Interdisciplinary Research, was reviewing the morning's briefing materials when Rebecca arrived for their weekly strategy meeting. The documents spread across Walsh's desk represented collaboration requests from organizations that would have seemed impossible partners just months earlier: NASA, the International Olympic Committee, autism therapy centers, and artificial intelligence development labs. "The aerospace engineering proposal is particularly intriguing," Walsh said without looking up from her reading. "They're convinced that your movement principles could improve spacecraft design by optimizing how astronauts interact with zero-gravity environments. The preliminary simulations suggest they could reduce mission duration by 30% through more efficient movement patterns." Rebecca settled into a chair designed using ergonomic principles derived from her combat research. Everything in the institute had been optimized according to function-based design rather than traditional aesthetics. The result was a workspace that felt simultaneously futuristic and completely natural. NASA represents the kind of application I never imagined when this started, Rebecca admitted, but the principles are universal. If they govern how humans move efficiently on Earth, there's no reason they wouldn't apply to movement in space. The aerospace collaboration had emerged from an unexpected source. Captain Lisa Chen, a former Air Force pilot who had become one of Rebecca's most accomplished students before being selected for the astronaut program. Chen's reports from simulated space missions had documented significant improvements in task completion times and resource utilization when astronauts were trained in principle-based movement. Traditional astronaut training focuses on adapting to zero gravity through repetitive practice, Chen had explained during her presentation to NASA administrators. Rebecca's approach teaches astronauts to understand the geometric relationships that govern efficient movement in any environment. Instead of memorizing specific procedures, they learn principles that allow them to optimize their movements for any situation they encounter. The NASA partnership represented just one facet of the Institute's expanding influence. The Olympic Committee's interest had been sparked by the performance improvements documented among athletes trained in Rebecca's methods. Swimmers were reducing lap times while expending less energy. Gymnasts were achieving greater precision while reducing injury rates. Track and field athletes were discovering movement efficiencies that improved performance across multiple events simultaneously. Dr. Michael Thompson, the committee's director of athletic performance research, had spent 3 months at the Institute, studying applications for elite competition. His final report had recommended immediate integration of principle-based training into national team development programs. We're seeing athletes who thought they had reached their performance ceiling discover entirely new levels of capability, Thompson had written. The improvements aren't marginal. They represent fundamental advances in how human bodies can be optimized for athletic competition. The most surprising development had been the therapeutic applications discovered by Dr. Sarah Martinez, a pediatric specialist who shared no family relation with Rebecca but had become fascinated by the potential for movement principles to address developmental disorders. Her pilot program working with autistic children had produced results that challenged conventional understanding of neurological condition management. Children on the autism spectrum often struggle with spatial awareness and social interaction, Dr. Martinez had explained to the Institute's quarterly review board. Teaching them movement principles that optimize their physical interaction with their environment has led to measurable improvements in communication, emotional regulation, and social adaptation. The therapy program had documented cases where children who had never achieved meaningful verbal communication began expressing themselves more effectively after just 6 months of principle-based movement training. The implications were staggering. If movement optimization could influence neurological development, it suggested connections between physical and cognitive function that mainstream medicine was only beginning to explore. These discoveries had attracted attention from the autism research community, leading to collaboration with research hospitals in Boston, Philadelphia, and San Francisco. The preliminary results were compelling enough to secure a $15 million research grant from the National Institutes of Health, establishing the first federally funded program to study movement-based interventions for developmental disorders. The corporate sector had proven equally receptive to Rebecca's innovations, though applications had emerged in directions no one had anticipated. The Ford Motor Company had implemented principle-based design in their manufacturing facilities, reorganizing assembly lines according to movement efficiency principles. The result was a 28% increase in production speed with a corresponding decrease in worker injury rates. We realized that if Rebecca's principles could optimize human movement in combat, they could also optimize human movement in manufacturing, explained Jennifer Park, Ford's Director of Industrial Engineering. By designing workstations and workflows according to geometric efficiency principles, we've created the most productive and safest manufacturing environment in our company's history. The automotive application had inspired similar adoptions across multiple industries. Amazon had restructured their fulfillment centers using principle-based logistics, reducing package processing times while improving worker satisfaction. Construction companies were discovering that crews trained in efficient movement principles could complete projects faster while experiencing fewer accidents. Perhaps most unexpectedly, the entertainment industry had embraced Rebecca's methods for entirely novel purposes. Hollywood stunt coordinators had found that principle-based training allowed performers to execute more spectacular action sequences while reducing the risk of injury. The resulting films featured fight choreography that audiences described as more realistic and emotionally engaging than traditional movie combat. Director Michael Stevens had built his latest action film entirely around principle-based fight choreography, working directly with Rebecca to ensure accuracy. The film's success had spawned a new genre of realistic action movies that prioritized movement authenticity over explosive visual effects. Audiences can sense when movement looks natural versus when it's choreographed for visual impact, Stevens had observed. Rebecca's principles create action sequences that feel viscerally real because they're based on how human bodies actually interact during conflict. The film's success had led to consulting contracts with major studios, creating yet another revenue stream that helped fund the Institute's research activities. Rebecca had been initially reluctant to work in entertainment, but she had come to appreciate how popular media could introduce principle-based concepts to audiences who would never encounter them through academic or military channels. The technology sector's adoption had proceeded along multiple parallel tracks. Video game developers were using Rebecca's movement principles to create more responsive character controls and realistic physics engines. Virtual reality companies were incorporating spatial relationship concepts into immersive environments. Even smartphone manufacturers were applying efficiency principles to user interface design. The most ambitious technology project was a collaboration with Boston Dynamics to develop robots capable of human-like movement optimization. The resulting prototypes demonstrated agility and adaptability that exceeded anything previously achieved in robotics, opening possibilities for applications ranging from disaster response to space exploration. Traditional robotics tries to program specific movements for specific situations, explained Dr. Kevin Liu, the project's lead engineer. By incorporating Rebecca's principles, we've created robots that can adapt their movement patterns to novel environments using the same geometric optimization that humans employ instinctively. The military applications had continued to expand as well, though much of that work remained classified. What could be discussed publicly was the establishment of the Department of Defense's Center for Advanced Combat Studies, which had become the primary government facility for developing principle-based applications for national security purposes. General Patricia Morrison, who had taken over leadership of the center, had publicly credited Rebecca's methods with revolutionizing how the military approached training and tactical development. Casualty rates among units trained in principle-based techniques had decreased by 60% during recent deployments, while mission success rates had improved proportionally. We're producing soldiers who can accomplish objectives that previously would have required much larger forces, Morrison had stated during a congressional hearing on defense innovation. The strategic implications are profound. Smaller, more efficient forces can project power more effectively, while reducing both operational costs and human casualties. The international implications had become equally significant. Allied military forces were requesting access to principle-based training, creating opportunities for diplomatic cooperation through shared tactical development. Several NATO countries had established exchange programs that allowed their personnel to train at American facilities, while providing their own expertise to collaborative research efforts. The academic world had embraced Rebecca's work with enthusiasm that bordered on revolution. Universities were establishing new degree programs that combined movement science with fields as diverse as psychology, philosophy, and engineering. The interdisciplinary approach was producing graduates who could apply principle-based thinking to problems that had previously seemed unrelated to physical movement. Professor David Chen's program at the University of Illinois had become the model for similar initiatives at institutions worldwide. Graduates were finding employment in industries that had never existed before. Movement consultants for architecture firms, efficiency specialists for manufacturing companies, and optimization analysts for professional sports organizations. The philosophical implications had attracted attention from unexpected quarters. Religious institutions were exploring how movement principles related to contemplative practices and spiritual development. Corporate leadership programs were incorporating principle-based concepts into executive training. Even relationship counselors were discovering applications for geometric communication principles in conflict resolution. Dr. Amanda Foster, a philosophy professor at Yale who had spent a sabbatical year studying at the Institute, had written extensively about the broader implications of Rebecca's discoveries. Her book, The Geometry of Human Experience, has become required reading in philosophy programs worldwide. Rebecca has demonstrated that efficiency principles governing physical interaction also apply to cognitive, emotional, and social relationships, Foster had argued. If we can optimize how humans move, we can also optimize how they think, feel, and relate to each other. The commercial success had created opportunities for expansion that Rebecca had initially resisted but eventually embraced as necessary for continued research funding. The Martinez method had become a registered trademark, with certified instruction available through licensed facilities on 6 continents. Training videos, equipment, and assessment tools generated revenue that supported research into increasingly specialized applications. The Institute maintained strict quality control over all commercial products, ensuring that the integrity of principle-based training was preserved even as it reached mass markets. Rebecca's personal journey had been transformed as dramatically as her professional accomplishments. The woman who had once been dismissed as practicing playground dancing now found herself consulted on decisions affecting national policy, international relations, and scientific research priorities. Speaking engagements took her around the world, addressing audiences ranging from military leadership conferences to academic symposiums to corporate strategy retreats. Her TED Talk had been translated into 47 languages and was being used as educational material in schools worldwide. Despite the recognition and success, Rebecca remained focused on the fundamental question that had motivated her original research. How could human potential be optimized through better understanding of natural principles? Each new application revealed additional layers of complexity, suggesting that her discoveries represented the beginning of exploration rather than its conclusion. The Institute's current research projects included investigations into principle-based approaches to aging, creativity enhancement, and collective decision-making. Early results suggested that movement optimization principles could influence mental acuity, artistic expression, and group dynamics in ways that challenged conventional understanding of human capability. As Rebecca reviewed the morning's research summaries, she reflected on a transformation that had exceeded every expectation she had held when first developing her unusual approach to combat training. The 50 techniques that had once seemed like the culmination of her work had become the foundation for discoveries that were reshaping human understanding across disciplines that spanned from space exploration to childhood development. The woman who had been mocked for her unconventional methods had proven that innovation required not just technical skill but the courage to question fundamental assumptions about what was possible. Her journey from ridicule to revolution demonstrated that true advancement came not from perfecting existing approaches, but from discovering entirely new ways of understanding the challenges they were meant to address. 5 years had elapsed since Rebecca Martinez first demonstrated her unconventional combat techniques in the basement of the Blackwater Combat Academy. The world she now inhabited bore little resemblance to the one where her methods had been dismissed as elaborate dancing. On this crisp October morning, she stood before the United Nations General Assembly, preparing to address world leaders about applications of principle-based optimization to global conflict resolution. The invitation to speak at the UN had come from an unexpected source, Secretary General Maria Santos, whose own country's military had implemented Rebecca's training methods with remarkable success in peacekeeping operations. Brazil's UN peacekeepers, trained in principle-based de-escalation techniques, had achieved the highest success rate in conflict mediation of any national contingent in the organization's history. "Ladies and gentlemen," Rebecca began, her voice carrying clearly through the packed assembly hall, "when I first developed what became known as the Martinez method, I believed I was simply creating more efficient fighting techniques. What I discovered was something far more profound. Universal principles that govern all forms of human interaction, from individual confrontation to international diplomacy." The audience included presidents, prime ministers, and diplomatic representatives from 193 countries, many of whom had witnessed firsthand how Rebecca's methods had transformed their nation's approaches to conflict management. The Japanese delegation had implemented principle-based negotiation in trade disputes, achieving unprecedented cooperation levels with historically difficult partners. The Canadian government had applied geometric communication principles to Indigenous relations, resolving land disputes that had persisted for decades. Behind Rebecca on the massive screen, Dr. Elizabeth Harper's research team had prepared a presentation that would have been incomprehensible to audiences just 5 years earlier. Charts and graphs demonstrated how movement optimization principles had been successfully applied to economic policy, environmental conservation, and social inequality reduction across 47 countries. "The fundamental insight," Rebecca continued, "is that efficiency principles are universal. Whether we're discussing how a human body moves through space, how information flows through an organization, or how nations interact on the global stage, the same geometric relationships determine optimal outcomes." The presentation's first section detailed the most dramatic international success story, the resolution of the Indo-Pakistani border dispute that had persisted for 70 years. Diplomatic teams trained in principle-based negotiation had achieved breakthrough agreements by applying redirection concepts to contentious discussions, transforming adversarial positions into collaborative problem-solving opportunities. Ambassador Singh of India rose to address the assembly. Traditional diplomacy taught us to meet opposition with stronger opposition, to counter demands with competing demands. The Martinez method showed us how to redirect conflict energy toward mutually beneficial solutions. For the first time in our nation's histories, we are cooperating rather than competing along our shared borders. Similar testimonials followed from representatives of other former conflict zones. The Israeli-Palestinian Water Rights Agreement, the resolution of territorial disputes in the South China Sea, and the successful mediation of civil conflicts in 3 African nations all demonstrated applications of principles that had originated in Rebecca's combat research. The economic applications had proven equally transformative. The European Union had restructured its decision-making processes according to efficiency optimization principles, reducing bureaucratic delays by 70% while improving policy effectiveness. The African Development Bank had applied principle-based resource allocation to infrastructure projects, completing initiatives ahead of schedule and under budget for the first time in the organization's history. Dr. Andreas Müller, the EU's Director of Administrative Optimization, had flown to New York specifically to present the Continental implementation results. We discovered that organizational inefficiency follows the same patterns as physical inefficiency, he explained to the Assembly. By applying Rebecca's geometric principles to institutional design, we created governance systems that accomplish more with less effort while better serving citizen needs. The environmental applications had perhaps the most far-reaching implications. Climate change mitigation efforts had been revolutionized through principle-based approaches that optimized resource utilization while minimizing waste generation. The Australian government's implementation of efficiency-based environmental policy had reduced carbon emissions by 40% while simultaneously improving economic performance. Prime Minister Thomson of Australia addressed the Assembly via video link from Canberra. Traditional environmental policy created opposition between economic growth and ecological protection, she explained. Principle-based policy design showed us how to redirect industrial development toward sustainable outcomes that serve both environmental and economic objectives simultaneously. The technology sector's global transformation had accelerated beyond all predictions. Artificial intelligence systems designed according to Rebecca's principles were solving previously intractable problems in fields ranging from disease treatment to space exploration. The Mars colonization project had adopted principle-based life support systems that required 60% less resources than traditional approaches, while providing superior safety margins. Dr. Kevin Liu, now director of NASA's Mars Mission Planning Division, presented updates on the space program's implementation via satellite link from Mission Control. Every system on our Mars colony ships operates according to efficiency principles derived from Rebecca's work, he reported. From habitat design to resource recycling to crew interaction protocols, we've created the most optimized human settlement system ever developed. The medical applications had evolved into a complete transformation of healthcare delivery. Hospitals worldwide were reporting unprecedented improvements in patient outcomes through principle-based treatment approaches that optimized healing processes rather than simply addressing symptoms. The World Health Organization had officially endorsed principle-based medicine as the new standard for global health policy. Dr. Sarah Martinez, whose autism therapy work had expanded into a comprehensive treatment system, addressed the Assembly from her research facility in Geneva. We've documented complete behavioral transformations in 93% of patients treated with principle-based interventions, she reported. Conditions previously considered permanent disabilities are proving responsive to optimization approaches that address underlying efficiency patterns rather than surface symptoms. The educational revolution had been equally comprehensive. UNESCO had redesigned its global education standards around principle-based learning, producing students who demonstrated unprecedented capabilities across all academic disciplines. Test scores had become almost irrelevant as students learned to apply fundamental principles to novel problems rather than memorizing predetermined solutions. Professor David Chen, whose university program had become the model for educational institutions worldwide, presented graduation statistics that challenged traditional assumptions about human learning capacity. Students trained in principle-based education are solving problems we didn't know how to pose 5 years ago, he reported. We're not just improving education. We're discovering new forms of human intelligence. The cultural impact had been subtler, but no less profound. Artistic expressions incorporating principle-based aesthetics were creating new forms of beauty that resonated with audiences in ways that traditional art forms had never achieved. Museums reported that visitors spent 3 times longer viewing principle-based artworks and described more intense emotional connections to the pieces. Rebecca's personal transformation remained the most remarkable aspect of the entire phenomenon. The woman who had once been dismissed as practicing elaborate avoidance techniques now found herself consulted on decisions affecting billions of lives. Her daily schedule included briefings from world leaders, research consultations with Nobel laureates, and strategic planning sessions for global initiatives. Yet she remained focused on the fundamental questions that had motivated her original research. During private moments between public appearances, Rebecca continued developing new applications of the principles that had already transformed multiple disciplines. Her current investigations into consciousness optimization suggested possibilities that challenged basic assumptions about human potential. The Institute's latest research had documented individuals who demonstrated capabilities that bordered on the seemingly impossible. Students who had mastered principle-based consciousness training were solving complex mathematical problems without conscious calculation, predicting social outcomes with uncanny accuracy, and demonstrating forms of pattern recognition that exceeded artificial intelligence capabilities. These discoveries had attracted attention from neuroscience researchers worldwide, leading to collaborative studies that were revealing previously unknown capacities of human brain function. Preliminary results suggested that consciousness itself operated according to efficiency principles, and that optimization could enhance cognitive abilities in ways that traditional education had never approached. The implications were staggering. If consciousness could be optimized using the same principles that governed physical movement, human potential might be far greater than anyone had imagined. Rebecca found herself at the center of research that could fundamentally alter understanding of what it meant to be human. As she concluded her address to the UN Assembly, Rebecca reflected on a journey that had begun with simple curiosity about efficient movement and had evolved into exploration of the deepest questions about human existence and potential. 5 years ago, I was mocked for suggesting that traditional fighting techniques were incomplete, she told the assembled world leaders. Today, we're discovering that all human activities, from individual movement to global cooperation, operate according to universal principles that can be understood, optimized, and applied to create outcomes that seemed impossible just a few years ago. The standing ovation that followed lasted for nearly 10 minutes, with representatives from nations that had been historical enemies applauding together in recognition of what principle-based approaches had accomplished in their own regions. The sight of former adversaries celebrating collaborative achievements represented the ultimate vindication of Rebecca's belief that efficiency principles could transform any form of human interaction. Hong Kalakshan. After the assembly session, Rebecca was approached by a young woman who introduced herself as Dr. Lisa Chen, a recent graduate of one of the principle-based education programs. Chen's doctoral dissertation had applied Rebecca's methods to quantum physics problems, achieving theoretical breakthroughs that had eluded researchers for decades. "I wanted to thank you personally," Chen said. "Your work didn't just give me better techniques, it gave me an entirely new way of thinking about what's possible. I'm part of a generation that will never accept limitations the way previous generations did, because we understand that any problem can be solved through proper application of fundamental principles." That evening, as Rebecca returned to her hotel room, she found herself thinking about the implications of Chen's words. The young physicist represented something unprecedented, a human being raised from childhood with the understanding that efficiency principles could be applied to any challenge. What would a generation of such individuals accomplish? The question had profound implications for humanity's future. If principle-based thinking could be integrated into human development from birth, the resulting capabilities might represent an evolutionary leap comparable to the development of language or written communication. Rebecca opened her laptop and began composing notes for her next research proposal, a comprehensive study of principle-based human development that would follow children from birth through adulthood, documenting the full extent of optimized human potential. The project would require decades of commitment and resources that only international cooperation could provide. As she wrote, Rebecca smiled at the irony of her situation. The woman who had been ridiculed for her unconventional approach to fighting was now designing research that could fundamentally alter human evolution itself. The 50 techniques that had once seemed like the culmination of her work had become the first steps toward discoveries that might transform the species. Outside her window, the lights of New York City stretched toward the horizon, representing millions of individuals whose lives had already been touched by principles discovered through her quest to understand efficient movement. Tomorrow, she would return to the Institute to continue research that was revealing new possibilities faster than they could be properly explored. The journey from mockery to global transformation had taught Rebecca that human potential was limited only by the breadth of understanding brought to its development. As she prepared for sleep, she contemplated a future where every human being would have access to optimization principles that could enhance every aspect of their existence. The woman who had been dismissed for practicing, quote, playground dancing had proven that true innovation required the courage to question fundamental assumptions about what was possible. Her transformation from ridicule to revolution would stand as permanent testimony to the power of principled thinking to create breakthrough discoveries that could reshape not just individual lives, but the trajectory of human civilization itself. In the quiet of her hotel room, surrounded by research notes that would guide the next phase of humanity's development, Rebecca Martinez had achieved something unprecedented: the transformation of a species' understanding of its own potential. The 50 techniques had become 50,000 applications, and those applications were still multiplying in ways that suggested the ultimate scope of her discovery remained unknown. The future stretched ahead, unlimited by the constraints that had once seemed permanent, optimized according to principles that promised possibilities beyond current imagination. The following morning brought news that would reshape Rebecca's understanding of her own discoveries. Dr. Yuki Tanaka from Tokyo University's Advanced Neuroscience Lab had transmitted findings from a longitudinal study involving children who had been exposed to principle-based learning from infancy. The results challenged every assumption about human developmental limits. "We're documenting cognitive capabilities that shouldn't exist according to current neuroscience," Tanaka explained during their encrypted video conference. Children who learn to walk using optimization principles are demonstrating mathematical intuition that surpasses trained mathematicians. 5-year-olds are solving engineering problems that typically require advanced degrees. We're not seeing incremental improvement, we're witnessing the emergence of fundamentally enhanced human cognition. The implications staggered even Rebecca, who had spent years pushing the boundaries of what seemed possible. If principle-based development could enhance cognitive function to such extraordinary degrees, humanity was approaching a threshold that would make current intellectual achievements appear primitive by comparison. The Tokyo findings had triggered emergency meetings at research institutions worldwide. Stanford's Cognitive Enhancement Project reported similar results from their pilot programs. Children exposed to principle-based education were not just learning faster. They were developing entirely new forms of intelligence that operated according to patterns no existing psychological theory could explain. Dr. Patricia Williams, whose transformation from accountant to martial arts expert had become legendary within Rebecca's circles, had established a residential school where children learned all subjects through principle-based approaches. Her latest report documented students who were creating original symphonies, designing architectural marvels, and formulating scientific hypotheses that professional researchers were struggling to verify. Traditional education teaches children to memorize information and apply predetermined methods, Williams had written in her quarterly assessment. Principle-based education teaches them to recognize underlying patterns and generate novel solutions. The difference in outcome isn't measurable, it's qualitative. We're educating an entirely different type of human being. The Vatican had quietly initiated its own investigation into the theological implications of Rebecca's discoveries. Cardinal Alessandro Bianchi, a former physicist who now headed the Church's Science and Faith Commission, had spent months studying whether principle-based human enhancement conflicted with religious doctrine about the nature of human souls. His confidential report, leaked through diplomatic channels, concluded that optimization represented the fulfillment of divine potential rather than its violation. If God created humans with capacity for such development, then failure to pursue that capacity might itself be considered a moral failing, Bianchi had written. These discoveries reveal the magnificent scope of creation rather than challenging it. The religious endorsement had profound cultural implications, removing moral objections that might have slowed adoption of principle-based development programs. Major denominations worldwide began incorporating optimization principles into spiritual practices, discovering that prayer, meditation, and contemplative disciplines could be enhanced using the same geometric relationships that governed physical movement. Rabbi Sarah Goldman of New York's Temple Emmanuel had pioneered applications in Jewish mystical practice, finding that principle-based meditation techniques produced spiritual experiences that traditional methods achieved only after decades of preparation. The divine is accessed through harmony with universal principles, she had explained to interfaith conferences. Rebecca's discoveries provide maps for navigating realms that mystics have explored intuitively for millennia. Corporate leaders were grappling with more practical implications of humanity's enhanced potential. If principle-based development could produce individuals with capabilities that exceeded current human norms, existing organizational structures would require complete reconstruction. Traditional hierarchies based on accumulated experience would become obsolete when 20-year-olds could outperform experts with decades of conventional training. Silicon Valley had already begun adapting to the new reality. Technology companies were restructuring around principle-based innovation teams that included individuals whose enhanced cognitive abilities allowed them to perceive solutions that eluded traditional research approaches. Patent applications had increased by 400% as optimized minds generated breakthrough inventions at unprecedented rates. Amazon's founder had publicly announced that his company's future competitive advantage would depend entirely on recruiting and developing principle-based talent. Traditional business strategy assumes human capabilities remain constant, he had stated during a shareholder meeting. We're entering an era where human capabilities are expanding exponentially. Companies that fail to adapt to enhanced human potential will become irrelevant within a decade. The societal tensions emerging from these developments concerned Rebecca more than the technical breakthroughs themselves. Enhanced individuals were beginning to form separate communities, finding that interaction with conventionally developed humans became increasingly difficult as their capabilities diverged. The potential for a permanent separation between optimized and traditional populations posed challenges that no society had ever faced. Dr. Marcus Webb, whose initial skepticism had evolved into deep philosophical engagement with Rebecca's work, had established the Institute for Human Integration, dedicated to preventing the emergence of separate castes based on cognitive enhancement. His research focused on developing bridge technologies that could help conventionally developed individuals interact meaningfully with their optimized peers. We're facing the possibility of human speciation within a single generation, Webb had warned during congressional testimony. If we don't develop systems that maintain social cohesion across capability differences, we risk creating conflicts that could tear civilization apart. The benefits of optimization mean nothing if they destroy the social fabric that makes human cooperation possible. International law was struggling to address questions that had never been contemplated. Should enhanced individuals be held to different legal standards, given their superior capabilities? Did conventional humans have rights to protection from competition with optimized individuals? How could democratic governance function when some citizens possessed cognitive abilities that rendered traditional political processes inadequate? The United Nations had established a special committee on human enhancement ethics, chaired by Judge Maria Santos of the International Court of Justice. The committee's preliminary recommendations included the establishment of integration protocols, enhancement accessibility standards, and protection mechanisms for both enhanced and traditional populations. We're not just governing technological development, Santos had explained during the committee's first public session. We're establishing the foundation for human civilization's next evolutionary phase. The decisions we make in the coming years will determine whether enhancement unites humanity or divides it permanently. Rebecca found herself at the center of debates that transcended her expertise in movement optimization. World leaders sought her guidance on questions that required wisdom beyond technical knowledge. How should enhancement be distributed? What safeguards were necessary to prevent abuse? How could societies maintain stability while undergoing fundamental transformation? Her response had been characteristically focused on principles rather than prescriptive solutions. The same efficiency relationships that govern physical movement also govern social organization, she had testified before the UN Ethics Committee. Sustainable enhancement must benefit all participants in the system, not just those who achieve optimization first. Any approach that creates permanent disadvantage for some individuals will ultimately fail because it violates fundamental principles of system stability. The committee had adopted Rebecca's framework as the basis for their recommendations, establishing enhancement as a human right while creating mechanisms to ensure equitable access. The resulting protocols required that any organization developing optimization techniques must also provide pathways for universal implementation. Private conversations with close colleagues revealed Rebecca's growing awareness that her discoveries had initiated changes beyond anyone's control. During a quiet dinner with Dr. Harper, she confessed feelings of responsibility that sometimes overwhelmed her sense of accomplishment. "I developed these techniques to make fighting more efficient," Rebecca had said. "I never imagined they would lead to the transformation of human consciousness itself. Sometimes I wonder if we're moving too fast, changing too much without understanding the long-term consequences." Harper had responded with characteristic scientific objectivity combined with personal warmth. Every major advancement in human capability has created similar anxieties. Writing, mathematics, scientific method. Each one worried contemporary observers who feared that human nature couldn't handle such dramatic enhancement. Yet each advancement ultimately expanded human potential in ways that made the concerns seem trivial in retrospect. The conversation had helped Rebecca recognize that her role was not to control the trajectory of human development, but to ensure that enhancement proceeded according to principles that served humanity's highest aspirations. Her continued research focused on identifying optimization approaches that enhanced wisdom alongside intelligence, compassion alongside capability, and cooperation alongside individual achievement. As she prepared to return to Chicago for the Institute's annual research review, Rebecca reflected on a transformation that had begun with her desire to understand efficient movement and had evolved into humanity's exploration of its ultimate potential. The woman who had been mocked for practicing unconventional techniques had become the catalyst for changes that would define human civilization for centuries to come. The 50 techniques that had started this journey now seemed like the first notes of a symphony that was still being composed. Each application revealed new possibilities. Each breakthrough suggested directions for further exploration, and each success demonstrated that human potential remained fundamentally unlimited when approached with proper understanding of universal principles. Standing in her hotel room overlooking the East River, Rebecca contemplated a species that was just beginning to discover what it could become. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.